Greetings, happy Monday. Welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Rose Seiler, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Andrea Benville, Beryl and Erin Swerdfeger, all from the Saskatchewan Conservation Data Center, will be speaking about the SK Conservation Data Center, or SKCDC, data collection, sharing, and uses. Before we begin, I'd like to state that we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I'd like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. Just a few items before we get going. I'd like to note that PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series is a monthly presentation about anything to do with Native Prairie conservation or species at risk. And on June 19th, in celebration of Native Prairie Appreciation Week, we'll be hosting a webinar about archaeology in Saskatchewan and cultural landscapes. And we'll take a break in July. As always, you can register for this webinar through the PCAP website. More information will be available there shortly. A reminder to our listeners out there, as we have over 100 registrants, you'll be muted for the duration of the webinar. But if you have any questions, just type it into the questions section of the webinar dashboard at any time, and questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. I'd like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our presenting sponsors, Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association, North American Helium, Nutrien, Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, and SaskTel, and in-kind support has been provided by the Government of Saskatchewan. So we've got three presenters today. I'm pleased to introduce all three of them. Erin Swerdfeger is an SKCDC zoologist, and she manages information on Saskatchewan's native wildlife species. Erin brings expertise on bats to the role through her master's in biology from the University of Regina and a strong foundation in planning and impact assessment from her environmental consulting experience. Erin loves spending time outside in the many varied landscapes of Saskatchewan. Beryl is the SKCDC Invasive Species Coordinator. Beryl has a Bachelor's of Science in Biology from the University of Saskatchewan, and she has over 20 years of experience with plant and vegetation-related work experiences in Saskatchewan and neighboring provinces. Beryl has worked in a variety of sectors: forestry, oil and gas, mining, research, conservation, and government. Focusing primarily on rare plant identification, she has worked in many areas of the province, including the Great Sandhills, the Cypress Hills, the Northern Provincial Forest, and the Surrey River Valley. Andrea Benville is the SKCDC Data Manager, and Andrea puts her GIS mapping and data management skills to work as the data manager for the CDC. Andrea has a Bachelor's of Science majoring in zoology from the University of Guelph and a postgraduate certificate from Fleming College in Geographic Information Systems as an application specialist. So with that, I'm pleased to pass it over to, I think Andrea will be sharing and Erin will be speaking.
Hey, welcome to our presentation, everyone. So we're going to be talking today about what the Saskatchewan Conservation Data Center does and who we are, how we collect, share, and use data. You can go to the next, please. So the Conservation Data Center is housed within the Fish and Wildlife branch of the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment, and we are a member of the NatureServe Network and NatureServe Canada. And our team consists of 6 people, or 6 core team members. So there's Jeanette Pepper, who is our coordinator and senior species at risk ecologist. Then Sarah Vinci-Mazer is our botanist. I, Erin Swerdfeger, am the zoologist. Beryl is our invasive species coordinator. Jessica Grenke is our vegetation ecologist, and Andrea Benville is our data manager. Next, please. An essential function of the Conservation Data Center is to manage the provincial database for gathering and distributing wild species information. So we collect and manage data following the NatureServe methodology and standards, and these standards are applied by programs like ours across Canada and the United States and several Central American and South American countries. So all of these programs map and track rare species, excuse me, following the same methodology and using the same software. And this standardization allows us to compare and contrast and combine biodiversity data across the continental range of a species. Next slide, please. Sorry. To make this program work well, we need to collect all of the wild species observations for the province. And we need your help to get us there. So what we do is we gather data from many sources, and then the data are shared and used to help us plan and manage for biodiversity. And as I explain how and why we do this, maybe you can think of some of the ways that you can contribute data or how you could use some of our data products in ways to help you in your work or in your life. So, and please don't hesitate, of course, to reach out after the presentation if you have questions or if you have data sharing ideas, or if you want to know more about what and how we do things at the SKCDC. I guess next, please. So the wild species mapping, planning, and decision-making process are only as good as the underlying data. And currently, there are some data deficiencies in Saskatchewan. So some of the data in our database is becoming pretty old. So we don't have paleontological data in our database, but some of our data points are kind of dinosaurs. For example, some of our rare plant data were collected before the 1990s. And so we don't really know in some ways if they're still there. And some of that is because we're a really big province and there are areas that are hard to access. And we actually have some areas where we don't have any data. And this could either be because people haven't done surveys there because they can't get there, or maybe they have tried to do surveys there and the data just haven't been shared with us. And this can become really important to fill in some of these gaps and improve our data quality, because this can help us to get closer to our overall goal of understanding how and when a species uses a habitat and how they disperse between habitat patches, so how like movement corridors and things like that. And then what a species might need to survive throughout its life history. So what kinds of habitats it's using and what requirements does it have? And so to get at these bigger questions, like connectivity and habitat use, then we need to have more data in our database and better data. Next, please. So generally, here's an overview of our process to go from data to answering some of these higher level questions. And to get at some of those questions of understanding interactions between a species and the land over time, we start with what we're calling a wild species observation. So what exactly is a wild species observation? So you're standing outside and you hear a bird singing. Now, to turn that into an observation, we need a few things. At a very minimum, we need a species name, the date that you saw it, and some information on who you are or where the observation information came from. And spatial location is also really important. So we want to record where you saw the thing happening, or the animal or the plant. And we can also factor into that locational information some uncertainty. So if you're standing there and you see a nest and you think it's maybe about 500 meters away from you, or you're using your phone or a GPS to record your location, we can kind of factor in some of the uncertainty in exactly where that thing is on the ground. And we can also account for data sensitivities, which I'll get into a little bit more later. And that helps us decide how and in what format the data might be able to be shared afterwards. So after we intake all of this information, we have a quality assurance and control process, or QA/QC. And in this step, we sort of ask questions about whether the observations that are submitted to us fall within the expected range of where that wild species might be found, or when we might expect to see it in the province. And we can flag other errors, like, maybe somebody mixed up a number or swapped two things. And so we can ask questions about those things and make sure that the data that are going into the database are the best quality that we can get them to. Then once we've checked it, we can map the data following that NatureServe methodology that I talked about earlier. And then we kind of have two streams. So our species of conservation concern go into our NatureServe database, and then more common species will go into what we call our observation database. And these data can then be searched and distributed to our end users through various data products, which I will explain a little more in a minute. Next slide, please. So the data in our database can come from various sources. So several groups in the province do wild species surveys and research. And so we at the Ministry of Environment issue wild species research permits to groups like non-government organizations, industry, academia, even museums. And so they go out and they do species detection surveys as part of their planning or research process. And under these permits, then they submit the data back to the Conservation Data Center. And this permit system allows us to ensure that surveys are following our conservation standards program for survey protocols. And this helps, especially in pre-development survey planning, to ensure that things are done in sort of a standardized way and data are collected and submitted in a standardized way as well. And this helps on the data side of things, but also to ensure like the highest probability of actually detecting a species if it's there, if it's in the place where they are. And we can also get data directly from the public. So platforms like iNaturalist or eBird, or community science programs like the Breeding Bird Atlas can allow anyone who's out on the landscape to observe something and then actually collect data on it, take that step of writing down the sort of who, what, when, where, why, and then submit that to us as well. And this all goes into our database, and it can then be used by people who are planning, for instance, those pre-development surveys or their research surveys. So they can use some of our data products like HABISask to go in and look at what someone's seen in the place that they're interested in before, or in the surrounding area, or similar types of habitat, and kind of plan what types of surveys they want to do and what's been found nearby. And then we can also use these data to fill in gaps in where there aren't observations. So we can develop modeling like habitat suitability modeling or species detection models, or species distribution models, sorry, and fill in some of those gaps. And we can also help to inform things like range maps. So where a species is expected to be found, if that changes over time, we can adjust that as observations are submitted to us. And we can also see these changes over time help, and also how many individuals are observed over time. And that can help to inform conservation planning and things like the conservation rankings and listing, and this feeds other sources down the road, which I'll explain more in a minute. Next slide, please. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that one of the things we consider as we intake data is sensitivity. And so all of our tracked species, and tracked species are things that we sort of keep a closer eye on, like they might be starting to be at risk, or they might be of interest for some kind of management reason. So those are all considered sensitive for species protection reasons, to make sure that their location is disclosed when it needs to be, and that they're not at risk by disclosing that location. And so we share some of those data outside of government for anyone who's signed a data sharing agreement. And even within that, once you've signed a data sharing agreement, some of the data submitted to us are considered sensitive for other reasons. So for landowner or lessee confidentiality, or sometimes if sharing the data might compromise intellectual or economic interests, then The data is kept inside our observation database and won't be released externally. And sometimes there's a time limit on that, like if an academic is going to publish a paper, so then after the publication date, the data aren't considered sensitive anymore, and we can remove that kind of flag on our data, and it can be incorporated in products that we send out. Internally, though, it's really important for us to still get those data because we can inform conservation rankings and create species lists and models and some of those other things that don't actually reveal the precise location of an observation, but they can still be really important. However, I should add the caveat that this not being allowed to share data externally can kind of limit how those data can contribute to conservation and research. So we try to limit the use of that field as much as we can, our data sensitivity field, because we want to be able to share the data, and we want to be sure that when we provide data out, it's kind of the best available data. So we try to avoid putting the sensitivity mark on things when it's not absolutely necessary. So next slide, please. And this is just an example of what one of our load forms looks like and some of the sensitivity fields that people can check. So they can say, yes, I want my data to be kept sensitive, and then they provide a reason, an explanation. And then if there's an end date on that sensitivity, they can indicate that as well. And next slide, please. So I mentioned before that one of the things we can do internally, whether data is marked sensitive or not, is to assign a provincial conservation rank, or what you might hear referred to as an S rank, which is subnational in the NatureServe hierarchy. So there's subnational, national, and global rankings for every wild species. And the ranks kind of range from 1 to a 5, with 5 being a secure or common species, and 1 meaning that the species is critically imperiled or extremely rare. So the lower the S rank, the higher the risk of extirpation, or the species sort of disappearing from our province. And then I said before, those S ranks get rolled up and compared across Canada into an N rank, or a national rank, and those get rolled up to all of the programs across the continent and into South America even, to get a global rank for the rarity of the species. And this can help us to provide prioritization for conservation efforts. And so we can focus our efforts on collecting data for those species, those tracked species. And then we also use these to author Saskatchewan taxa list or species lists that are posted on our website that include the ranks, as well as ranks from like where they fall under the Wildlife Act, or CSIWIC, which I'll get into a minute later, and the Species at Risk Act. And then you can also find, for vascular and non-vascular plants, sort of the expected ecoregion or part of the province where you'll find that species. Next slide, please. So I mentioned CSIWIC, that big acronym. So one of the things that we use these data for is we get data requests from the Committee on the Status of Wildlife in Canada, or CSIWIC, and they conduct assessments on the status of species, and their recommendations then go on to inform the listing under the Federal Species at Risk Act. And there are other data products that we use, such as NatureServe Canada has been working on something called EBAR mapping, or ecosystem-based automated range maps, which I mentioned before, having these observations over time of individuals or groups of species or their habitat use can help to provide information on how their habitat use and their range is changing over time. And having these CSIWIC species prioritized and having our status assessments can help us to prioritize which maps are going to be done first in something like that EBAR mapping. So those are just a few of the ways that we collect and use and distribute data. And I will turn it over to Beryl to talk about some of the other types of data that we interact with at the SKCDC.
Hello, everybody. As indicated, I am the invasive species coordinator, and you might think, well, why are you doing invasive species if your concern is rare and endangered species? Well, the IUCN indicates that the invasive species is the second greatest threat to biodiversity after habitat loss. So in an effort to collect data on invasive species in the province, we participate in an online invasive species mapping tool and database called iMapInvasives, and we hope that it is useful to managers of invasive species, scientists, and local citizens. Next slide, please. This is what it looks like. Currently, these are the participating jurisdictions: New York, New Hampshire, Oregon, Arizona, Florida, Saskatchewan, and we also recently, the Atlantic provinces will be joining us in participating in the iMapInvasives platform. Next. I find that the most useful thing I find about it is that anybody can sign up for an account. We have 2 field apps that people can use to collect data out in the field, take a picture, add information, and use offline, come back into Wi-Fi and submit the data into the system. So the data is shared, stored and shared electronically. And if you want, you can also set up for email alerts on geography, species. So it contributes to the early detection and rapid response to invasive species management. Next slide, please. The uses, this is showing the distribution. You've got an international distribution showing that you can filter on. And then on the right, you see the local distribution that you can come in and zoom in specifically. So you can get a broad to a very narrow look at the particular species you're wanting to. There's a public map that shows just confirmed publicly available data. If you have an account, you can see confirmed data, unconfirmed data, approximate data. And if you're part of an organization, you can see treatment data as well. Below the slide are the websites that you can sign up for an account. Next slide, please. There are 2 field apps. One is a point and shoot, easy, very simple collection. Take a photo, tell me what you think it is, where you saw it, who you were, and submit a point and submit it, which is the first app. And then the second app is a survey 1, 2, 3, which you can collect data on points, polygons, lines, treatments. However, the second one is a little bit more tech heavy, so it's not as simple as the point and shoot, but they both work offline, and you can submit data from the field with these 2 mobile apps from your mobile devices. Next slide. The email alerts, as I said, you can sign up for a species. I have my alerts set up that it will send me an email if somebody reports a prohibited species, as well as I have a alert set up specifically for leafy spurge that will also send me alerts when somebody submits so if you were an RM inspector, you could set it up for your RM and a specific species, so you would receive an email if somebody reported that species in your jurisdiction or under your species. I also have an alert for all new records that come in so that I can verify. All data comes into the system as unconfirmed unless it's bulk loaded, and so I take a look at what comes in and either confirm or leave it unconfirmed. And the system is also set up that people and projects can verify their own data, but you have to get in touch with me, the administrator, to do so. Next. This is just a slide of the various species on the list. Currently, we have over 800 registered user accounts. We have on the list, there's 226 species that I have currently tracked. Now, that species list includes all prohibited and noxious and nuisance species in the local, provincial, and federal legislation. However, I do have anything that is considered invasive in a natural setting. So there's everything from something that's negligibly invasive to very invasive on the listing. And to date, we have that listing, I only have 104 that are currently recorded in the system. And there are right now over 45,000 records in the system. Next. So why should you care? Here's three case studies if you want. On the left shows the watercraft movement through Saskatchewan in 2019. We had over 2,000 watercraft inspected that year. So if you take that information, you can see where the boats are coming from and going to, and that translates into potential hitchhikers such as quagga mussels or zebra mussels or other aquatic invasive species. And the picture shows a beach in Ontario with the remains of zebra mussels and a pipe clogged with zebra mussels. Just an issue. On the top left is the scarlet lily leaf beetle, which is in the province, and potentially, if it gets into the native population, into the native lily population, the middle photo is a picture of population, and then the one on the right, I've photoshopped to show that the lilies are gone. And then the one at the bottom there is the flowering rush, which has also entered into the province in the South Saskatchewan River. And if you can query these videos at Flathead, Idaho, and in Alberta to get an indication of how this invasive species is impacting or has impacted those ecosystems. And I'll turn it back over to Andrea, I believe. Oh, whoops, sorry. Beg my pardon. There's where you can sign up for a user account. You should get an email, check your junk mail for if it doesn't arrive fairly quickly after you sign up account. But I encourage everybody to sign up and start reporting invasive species in the province. Next slide. Yeah. And
yeah, thanks, Beryl. Yeah, so as mentioned, I'm Andrea. I'm the data manager with the Conservation Data Center. So I respond to a lot of data requests for data. So I'm just going to delve into a few use cases that Erin's kind of mentioned in a little more detail. So we can see here the image on the left with the red dots is showing occurrences in our database of the chestnut-collared longspur that were available. And then the image on the right is showing an example of a species predictive model that was created predicting where its habitat would occur. So like we said, we have some gaps in our data. It's only going to show where people have submitted data to us or where surveys have been done, and surveys certainly haven't been done and everywhere in the province. So the species distribution models that we've created help cover some of those gaps and make our data a little more useful. So the Fish and Wildlife Branch has currently created about 30 of these for species at risk in the province that are available for use. And one of these uses is with conservation planning. So a really good example of use of our data here is with the ecosystem-based automated range maps, or EBAR that Erin mentioned are used for Kasiwit. They're also used for the Key Biodiversity Areas project. So with the Key Biodiversity Areas project in Canada that's currently trying to identify areas that would be suitable, there's certain criteria such as species ranges, where species occur. And this is where NatureServe Canada has really come in to do some of the data mining for that project and is using data from across conservation data centers to identify some of these new KBAs. Another use is with pre-development planning. So when industry wants to develop in a new area within the province, we have our data made available to them to be able to see where species at risk are occurring in the province. So we have an app that's available called HABISask, which stands for Hunting, Angling, and Biodiversity Information of Saskatchewan. And one of the primary users of the biodiversity portion of that app is industry and environmental consultants. So within that app, once you sign in, there's a project screening tool that industry can use. And this will summarize information in an area that includes the Conservation Data Center rare and endangered species occurrences, but also some federal data sets such as the Greater Sage Grouse Emergency Protection Order, federal critical habitat, woodland caribou, species predictive models, important natural areas such as important bird and plant areas. And the prairie landscape inventory is also available on HABISask, which predicts where native prairie will occur within the province. So because our data is considered sensitive at certain levels for industry, we need to sign a data sharing agreement before we can use this project screening tool in HABISask. So this is just a screenshot showing what our data sharing agreement looks like. You can download it from our website if you're interested in using HABISask. And here is just a screenshot of what the app looks like. So those red and green and purple locations on the map are all examples of what our occurrence data looks like once you sign into HABISask. So you'll see some of the circles are bigger than others, and that's because we map uncertainty. So for some occurrences, we don't always have a lot of information available to map it. So especially for like old herbarium records, for example, we may just have information that it occurred in Elbow, Saskatchewan. So we know maybe it was within a couple of thousand meters of that. So we are going to map that into our occurrence to say we don't exactly know where it is. So we're not saying it's in the center of the polygon, but somewhere within. Also for things like auditory observations, for example, someone might be just taking that from the road, but it doesn't mean that the GPS point that they took on the road is where the species is. So we will map the locational uncertainty with that and say, well, it's within a couple hundred meters of this point. And this is an example of when an environmental consultant or industry is logged in to the app and using our project screening tool. They can put in their project location and buffer it, and it'll summarize all the information in the area. So then you get a PDF report and it shows all the species occurrence data summarized in one place, as well as information on where you can get permit information and things like that you might need to follow up. Now, HABISask is a good example of where you need to sign in to use our data, but there is also other public places where you can access our data. So one place is through NatureServe Explorer. Now, over the last couple of years, NatureServe Explorer has kind of gone over a facelift and has a few more functionality than it did before. So I'm going to actually just open my browser to show you. Pull it up here. So you can access it through any browser. It's explore.natureserve.org, or just go to the NatureServe website. You can find it through there. It'll open up the NatureServe Explorer website. So as Erin mentioned, the CDC is a member of the NatureServe network, along with a ton of other programs across North America. So what this does is summarizes that information across the continent, and you can see it all in one place. So you can search for a species or ecosystem here, or you can go to the additional search options if you have more information that you want to enter. One important thing to note is that under classification, you should include subspecies, varieties, and populations if you're trying to search for a subspecies of a plant, for example, or a branchula. So I'll just type in snapping turtle, for example. We can see it here. This is an example of what a page looks like. So it's just summarizing all the information across the network that's available within NatureServe's central database. You can see information like classification information that was used to determine the scientific name and concept. We have all the ranks across the network here. There's also information about how we arrived at the global rank and the factors that went into that. And there's ecology and life history at the bottom, so things like habitat can be found here. So this map is where NatureServe has really been focusing a lot of their development time in the last couple of years. So you can see now, as opposed to the static maps that we used to have, you can actually zoom in and interact. And there's actually this documented distribution option that you can turn on. And where available, this will show species occurrence information on the map. So one good thing to know is that currently, with the way this website works, the CDC is just providing data to it annually. So if you're doing something like I mentioned with HABISask, where you're doing project screening, this isn't really an appropriate tool yet because it doesn't necessarily have all of our data. So for sure, if you're doing a more specific project and where you really need to make sure you have all the data, make sure you're contacting us to make sure you can get the data from the appropriate source and get everything. But if you're just trying to learn more about the species, see what's available across more than just Saskatchewan, see what's over in Manitoba as well, this is a great place where you can kind of play around with it and see what's there. So there's this option View on Explorer Pro, and that'll just open up the map into a bigger window where you kind of have more control. You can turn on and off layers and kind of explore a little more. So this is available to anyone through the public. You can just make a public account. However, everything is limited to however each jurisdiction has set their rules. So for Saskatchewan, for most species, you can view them up to the 1 mile hexagon, but you can't see the actual polygons the way that you can in HABISask. For species that are subject to persecution and harm, you'll notice they're even bigger polygons. So it might be like a 7 mile hexagon as opposed to that 1 mile. So that's things like burrowing owl or orchids that are vulnerable to collection. That kind of summarizes NatureServe Explorer, but I kind of encourage you to go check it out for yourself. It's explorer.natureserve.org there. So moving on to kind of how you can submit your data, because I'm sure after seeing all of these wonderful ways that you can use data, you probably have some data you'd like to submit to us too. So it kind of just depends who you are and how much data you have, what option you might want to choose. We have a variety of options. And of course, if you're not sure, we're happy to have a meeting with you or phone call and we can discuss some of those options. So if you are working kind of like as an environmental consultant or an academic researcher and you have a Government of Saskatchewan wild species research permit, you will have data submission requirements under that. And through that data will all be forwarded to the Conservation Data Center. So you don't need to submit your data twice. But if you're not submitting through a permit, we do have these Excel load forms available for anyone to use as well. And that's a really great option if you have a lot of data, you just kind of want to copy and paste into a place. It's good for the bulk data transfer. So I'll just kind of pull up a load form. Actually, you can show you what it looks like. So here, if you go to our website, biodiversitysk.ca is where you'll find this to download. There's 4 tabs across the bottom. The first tab is metadata, where it just has lots of instructions and where you can put your name so we can contact you if you have questions. There's also the attribute help here, of course. But the animal observation data and plant observation data tab are where you would enter your data. So you'll notice there's a lot of fields, but you don't need to get overwhelmed like that. We have all the fields that are required bold. So for example, we need the species name, the date, the location, and whether or not the species is a sensitive observation, such as for landowner sensitivities. So that is all required, but the other stuff is kind of just gravy. Please submit it if you have it, but don't get too hung up on the number of fields if you don't. So for something like an animal where maybe it's a migratory species, we do really appreciate if you can fill out things like breeding bird status in the residence field, because that'll help us map it and know the location use class. Because with migratory species, we don't necessarily know how they're using the landscape. So it's great to get little extra information if it's nesting there or, you know, if it's a hibernaculum. And then the plant observation data tab is quite similar, just with fields tailored more towards plants. So things like identification characteristics, because they're a little harder to identify and have a little trickier taxonomy. So another option, if you're not into that, we do have, of course, like Beryl was saying, there's iMapInvasives that you can submit data directly to. And there's also iNaturalist. So iNaturalist.ca is a website that's available to anyone through the public. You can create a free account. So it's great for the whole family or yourself. And we actually have a project through the CDC. Here's a screenshot of it there. So if you're familiar with iNaturalist, if you go to kind of the community section at the top, that's where you'll find lots of projects that you can join. And I encourage you to join our Conservation Data Center project. By joining our project, that will just make sure that we do get those observations and we can see their locations in cases where you might be obscuring it from the public. So yeah, that's all I have to say for now. But if you'd like to contact us for more information, here's a bunch of our contact information. That skcdc.data@gov.sk.ca is kind of one of our main contacts. So if you just want to write down one, that would be the main one. But here's where you can access all the different things I talked about today. And yeah, with that, I think I'll pass it over to Caitlin or anyone else to see if there's been any questions.
Yes. First of all, thank you so much for the great presentation. We've already had a few questions coming in, so maybe we'll just jump to that section there. To all of our attendees, if you have any questions, just type it into the Q&A section on the dashboard. So the first one, does your agency collect data on non-invasive plant species showing up in the province for the first time?
Yeah, I keep a track on initial stuff. Usually, so far, it's either been coming in on email or on iNaturalist. I've added the onion peel, blue mustard. You know, if something comes in, I'll go look and see what it's doing in other jurisdictions, and or if somebody wants to track it, I've added Palmer's amaranth according to at the request of the weed specialist. They want to be able to track it in the province when it starts to show up.
Perfect. That makes sense. Have you had that happen quite a few times?
I've added between 2 and 3 species a year that people want to that it's introduced and has some sort of evasive quality to it that I've added to so that people can start reporting and recording it. It does not have to be in the it doesn't have to be listed in the regulations like the prohibited and noxious. This is I've included other stuff so that we can have an idea if it's becoming a problem or not in the province.
That makes sense. It's good to know that somebody's keeping an eye out for these things and doing something about it. So that's great. Our next question is from one of our attendees. They say, great presentation. I have a place close to Priestville, Saskatchewan, and I see species at risk like northern leopard frogs in a few places. I see western tiger salamanders a few times a summer. I assume I should report that with iNaturalist, but I also see things like great horned owls, hawks, osprey, and I assume I should not report these more common species. I don't know if you have any comments about that.
Take that one. Yeah, I think that we would like observations of everything that you are interested in giving. So great horned owls are great. We do really value information on common species as well. Like I said, they go into a different stream. So it's the observation database instead of that like NatureServe database. But we keep track of them because that allows us to see over time if the populations are declining and they're becoming less common, or something that wasn't as common becomes more common, and how their distribution is changing. So even if it's common, it's still really important to have data on those. So yeah, please send everything.
Awesome. That's great. So some people who live near wildlife, feel free to sit down on a rainy day and send all that information in. And just a reminder, because we have lots of people on the webinar, everyone will be muted. So if you have any questions, just take a minute and type it into the question section. I'll give everyone a few more minutes to type your questions in now. And I just want to remind everyone that PCAP has been recording this webinar. So when probably in the near future, we'll get it uploaded to the YouTube channel and you can watch it again or share it with anyone who might be interested as well. We also have a huge inventory of amazing webinars online there. So you can just go to our YouTube channel and search. You can put in Erin Bats and get her past webinar, as well as other ones about, I think way back from the SKCDC about maybe Sarah Van G. Mazer did one about rare plants, but it's a huge resource. All sorts of different species are available online there. So you can just search our YouTube channel to find something. So a listener named Ed has typed in, no question, just compliments to the SKCDC. An excellent presentation. Nice to see their ranks have grown with a couple needed positions to address the many data needs around species at risk and invasive species. Great to see the data sharing platforms evolving as well, as certainly the technology evolves, but also as clients' data demands increase and broaden. Well done. Oh, and thank you to PCAP for hosting. So I just thought I'd pass that on. I have a question. I was wondering if other provinces have CDCs like Saskatchewan does, and if they have as many staff as you do or as few as you do. I'm not sure who the best person to answer that is.
Yeah, for sure. And it varies. It just kind of depends on the size of the government, really. Like places like BC and Ontario have much bigger staff, and then there's lots of places like us that are a little smaller. But yeah, I think all the territories and provinces have them. I think in the east, it's kind of one combined for some of those smaller provinces there on the east coast. But yeah, everyone's a member in some capacity.
Okay, well, it's amazing the work that you do with the few people that you have there.
Yeah.
So we have an attendee who's wondering if there are currently any RMs using iMapInvasives with alarms and notification method to track invasive species and watch for new invasives in their area.
Most of the RMs that I've been dealing with have been using it to report their data and some of their treatment. Not a lot of them yet have signed up for email alerts and that.
Okay. Yeah, that seems like a really neat feature. That would be a good application for it. Yeah, hopefully they can get on board.
Yeah, that was one of the hopes, is that they would find it useful.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. The next question, do you incorporate data from projects such as the breeding bird surveys or other platforms such as eBird, butterfly citizen science data platforms, or would you require all these data to be submitted again to the CDC?
Yeah, we do. So you don't need to submit it again. Sometimes we're a little behind in some of our, there's lots of data out there, especially through things like eBird. But yeah, we will eventually be mining those things. And we do kind of on a regular basis do data exchanges with things like eButterfly and most recently with the SK Bird Atlas. We've been working with them to get their QC data into our database. So yeah, for sure, we try to use those citizen science projects out there wherever possible, so that you don't end up having to submit them twice.
Awesome. That's great.
Yeah.
It's nice that there's collaboration. For Andrea, do you acquire data from Canadian Wildlife Service or federal agencies, other jurisdictional wildlife agencies? Are there any data submissions from First Nations or Métis communities?
Yeah, that's a good question. We do where possible. For sure, we try to work with our the federal government on getting observations from them wherever possible. We're always kind of working with Grasslands National Park, for example, to exchange data. Yeah, when it comes to First Nations communities, I think that might be a bit of a data gap. I don't think I know of too many submissions that we've gotten there. So maybe that's where we have some work to do.
Yeah. And then a listener named Wade says, are there any thoughts on having an app for the load forms instead of Excel sheets?
There are. I think it's complicated when it comes to the permit data.
Okay.
There's not one in development right now.
Okay. That makes sense. Okay, well, I think that's all the questions we have at the moment. We'll give everyone one more minute to send it in. Perfect. And I'll just remind everyone to check out PCAP's upcoming webinar in June about archaeology in Saskatchewan, as well as cultural landscapes. And you can register for that for the PCAP on the PCAP website. We don't have all of our information on there yet, but it will be coming soon in the near future. Well, I guess that's all the questions that we have. So I just want to reiterate some of the comments that have come in from our attendees. Thank you for this awesome presentation. It was really informative, and it's really good to know that there's such an amazing organization out there and the good work that you're doing. And it's nice to have faces to people who care about conservation in Saskatchewan. So thank you, all three of you, for the great presentation today. Thanks to our attendees. If you miss one of our past presentations, check it out on the website or our YouTube channel. And then, oh, actually, we got one more quick question. Sorry, somebody says, I entered a rare bird sighting through eBird. It was a female cardinal seen about a week ago. Hopefully you guys get that through. That'd be really neat. I don't think I've seen a cardinal in Saskatchewan. So just when everyone leaves their webinar today, there'll be a quick 1-minute survey that will pop up. If you don't mind taking a minute to answer that, we really appreciate getting feedback from our attendees and also looking to see about, yeah, like what topics people want to hear about from the future. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.